Soldiers of Christ, arise and put your armor on. Strong in the strength which God supplies. Strong in the strength which God supplies through his beloved Son. Strong in the Lord of hosts and in his mighty power. Who in the strength of Jesus trust. Who in the strength of Jesus trust is more than conqueror. Standing in his great might, with all his strength endued. But take to arm you for the fight. But take to arm you for the fight, the panoply of God. Leave no unguarded place, no weakness of the soul. Take every virtue, every grace. Take every virtue, every grace, and fortify the whole. That having all things done and all your conflicts past, you may o'ercome through Christ alone. You may o'ercome through Christ alone and stand entire at last.
We're going to be looking again at King Saul today, and I want us to look at the latter half of the first book of Samuel, because in it we have outlined the decline of this once great man. I want us to try to trace the decline and to see what happens when a man forsakes God and acts disobediently. You recall that we saw how very promisingly this man began when he became the first king of Israel. And yet, about chapter 13, the second half of the book, we see how he becomes almost possessed with madness, or he becomes a mad person, certainly becomes melancholy, and several times resorts to attempts on the life of David, and even resorts to great massacres as the result of the disposition that has taken him. I want you to turn to chapter 13 first. All the others are in now. I think we're about ready to begin. Chapter 13. Now, here is the record of one serious act of disobedience on the part of King Saul. If you look down at verse 8 to begin with, he waited 7 days, that's King Saul awaited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me, and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him and salute him. Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down upon me at Gilgal, and I have not entreated the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him to be the prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Now, this actually refers to the earlier chapter, chapter 10, where, with a view to the battle with the Philistines, Samuel had given instructions to Saul at 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 8. Samuel had said, "And you shall go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I am coming to you to offer burnt offerings and to sacrifice peace offerings. 7 days you shall wait until I come and show you what you shall do." Now here you see Saul's impatience is manifesting itself. He's gone to Gilgal, but for some reasons Samuel is delayed. He doesn't come within the appointed 7 days. And Saul is not prepared to wait. He intrudes into the priestly office. He undertakes to do himself the work that only the priest should do. And we've emphasized this time and time again. In the Old Testament, never was a king allowed to function as a priest. The only time that happened way back in the very beginning is in the book of Genesis, when we know of a certain man, Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham when Abraham returned from the slaughter of the kings, and he offered sacrifices on behalf of Abraham. But from the time of Melchizedek in the Old Testament, right through to the coming of Jesus, no king was ever allowed to function as a priest at the same time, because those two offices, king and priest, were to be united in the Savior, in Jesus Christ. "He shall be a priest upon his throne," the prophet had said. And that's why Jesus today is a priest after the style of Melchizedek, the writer of the letter to the Hebrews says. So here, instead of waiting for the priest to come and offer the sacrifice, and remember Samuel was also serving as a priest, Saul was impatient. He could not wait. He disobeyed, and he intruded into the priestly function and offered the sacrifice himself, with the result that Samuel said, "You've disobeyed, you've acted foolishly, and God will take your kingdom from you." Now that's not the only act of disobedience. In the very next chapter, chapter 14, there's an interesting story of how Jonathan, the son of Saul, with his armor-bearer, went and, he had a little skirmish with the Philistines. Evidently the Philistines were camped at a certain place, and there was a pause before the battle was joined, and Jonathan went out, but first of all he said, "It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." In other words, perhaps God will do something for us today. And he went on farther at verse 16. He said, "If the Philistines say, 'Come up to us,' then we shall go up, because the Lord has given them into our hand. That'll be the sign." And so he went along, and the Philistines saw him. And I like this little bit. The Philistines said, "Look, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they hid themselves." You can sense the sarcasm and the scorn that the Philistines felt for the Hebrews. "Oh, they're crawling out of their holes, would you believe it?" And they shouted to Jonathan in his armor, "Come on, we'll show you something. We'll show you a thing or two if you come down here." Well, that's just the very sign that Jonathan was waiting for. And he said, "Come up after me. The Lord has given them into our hands." And he went down, and 20 or so of the Philistines were slain. Well, of course, this created quite a tumult, and the tumult was heard in the camp of the Israelites. And when Saul heard the tumult and saw the dust being stirred, he wondered what it was all about. He thought the Philistine army was at last on the move, and he had to be ready. Now, it was the practice among the people of God in those days, before they went into battle, to seek the will of God. You have a very fine example in the second book of Kings, chapter 5. Second book of Samuel, rather, chapter 5 and verse 19, where before David goes into battle, he asks the priest to consult with God, to see what the will of God was, and to ask for God's support in the battle. And so Saul, in this 14th chapter of 1 Samuel, is about to go through the same procedure. If you look at verse 18, "And Saul said to Ahijah," that's the priest, "Bring hither the ark of God." For the ark of God went at that time with the people of Israel. And while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. And Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Now, what does it mean? On the surface, it doesn't seem anything. But it simply means this, that the priest was going through the function, the ceremony of seeking the will of God, But Saul simply couldn't wait. He said, "Oh, pull your hand out. Stop it. Give over. Leave it alone. Let's get on with the business of fighting." And it means that rather than wait for God's advice through the priest, he acted impetuously. He trusted more in his own ability as a soldier to handle those Philistines than to wait for the blessing of God. And as I say, the contrast is David, who would not take one step before he went to consult God. Or there's the case of Jehoshaphat later on, when King Ahab wanted Jehoshaphat to help him to regain some cities from the Syrians. And Jehoshaphat said, "What does God say about it? Will God give us the battle? And is there any man of God to seek God for us?" But not Saul. He was impetuous and acted, wanted to act on the strength of his own prowess as a soldier, rather than on the wisdom of God. Then again in chapter 15, there's another act of disobedience that's recorded. You know this story. We were talking about it on Thursday night, as a matter of fact, in the Young Christians class. King Saul is commanded by God to destroy the Amalekites, whom God describes as those sinners. And God tells him to destroy Amalek utterly, to leave nothing alive. And Saul goes out to battle with King Agag of the Amalekites. The Amalekites are defeated, but Saul does not obey God. In the first place, he spares the king of the Amalekites, and he takes as the prize of battle the choice flocks and herds of the Amalekites. Of course, he has a religious excuse for that, because later on he says the people spared them to offer to the Lord thy God. I didn't do it, the people spared them to offer as a sacrifice to the Lord your God. And he's coming back. God speaks to the prophet Samuel and tells Samuel, "Saul has disobeyed me. I'm sorry that I made him to be king." And he sends Samuel out to meet the returning King Saul. And King Saul instantly says, "Blessed be thou of the Lord, I have obeyed the commandment of the Lord." And Samuel says, "If that's the case, what's the meaning of the lowing of the oxen and the bleating of the sheep that I hear? If you've done what God told you to do." And that's where this religious excuse came. The people spared them to offer to the Lord your God. And Samuel put the question to him, "Has the Lord as great delight in sacrifices and in burnt offerings as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Do you think it's far more important to offer a sacrifice than to do what you're told? Behold, to hearken is better than sacrifice. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken better than the fat of rams." Then he tells him again, "Because you've done this, your kingdom is taken from you and given to another man who is better than you are." Now, from that time on, if you'll notice right there, excuse me, if you'll notice at the end of that 15th chapter, then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went to his house in Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. In other words, it simply means they never went to see him again. But Samuel grieved over Saul. Although Samuel never went again to see that disobedient king, he was really sorry that things had turned out as they did. And we're told the Lord repented that he'd made Saul king over Israel. And that's really the death knell in the career of this man Saul, because from that moment things went from bad to worse. He was deprived of the blessing of God. He was deprived of the advice of the wise old Samuel, and he was left to his own resources. And as I say, from this time on, things went from bad to worse. Now, I'm pretty sure that a certain, we used the word melancholy on Tuesday night. Well, that's exactly what happened. A certain melancholia came over this man. He became subject to fits of depression, madness, in fact. If you look at verse 14 of chapter 16. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. Now that was the Spirit of God that came upon him at the time of his anointing when he was made king. And an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. This is just an Hebraism for saying that he became subject to to mental problems. If you want to know why it says that an evil spirit from the Lord, simply because the Hebrews regarded everything that came, whether good or bad, as coming from God. And this passage in plain modern terms simply says that the king became subject to depression and he became mentally unstable. Notice here, verse 15, and Saul's servant said to him, Behold now, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful in playing the lyre. And when the evil spirit from God is upon you, he will play it and you will be well. Now the ancients have for a long time known the soothing influence of music in fits of depression and in mental disturbances. The father of medicine, Esculapius, used music in some instances to soothe his patients. And some of the great philosophers of the past always had music played to them before they went to sleep at night. The idea of the soothing quality of music. And this is really what was done in this particular case to soothe this man King Saul. Music was played to him to bring his mind to rest again. And they sought out somebody to play to him. Now who do you suppose they found? Well, they found a son of Jesse, David actually. And we're told that David was brought before Saul, in verse 21, entered his service, and Saul loved him greatly. And verse 23, whenever an evil spirit from God was upon Saul, whenever he had a fit of depression, David took the lyre and played it with his hands, so Saul was refreshed and well, and the evil spirit departed from him. He was soothed. Now you can see the man is breaking up mentally. Now, I'll prove that he's breaking up mentally, because here in chapter 16, David is introduced to the court of Saul. He plays for Saul, evidently not on a full-time basis. Evidently he was not completely, fully in the service of Saul, because he would come to the palace whenever he was needed, and then go back to his little village of Bethlehem, just outside of the city. And we're told that Saul loved him greatly. But you look at the next chapter, chapter 17. Chapter 17 is that famous story of Goliath. Now Saul is living at home with his father, David's living at home with his father, and the Philistines were at war with Israel. David's elder brothers have gone to the battle, and so his father Jesse sends him up to the battle lines with some food for his brethren. Nothing's happening. Battles were fought in a very leisurely fashion in those days, you know. I mean, they just stood on the opposite side of the valley and shouted insults at each other. You know, this was really it. Nobody would venture, to begin with, the Philistines were not going to venture down into the valley, because that put them at a disadvantage with the Israelites up on the hillside. And the Israelites, for their part, were certainly not going to go down into the valley either, because they would be in the same predicament. And so the two armies were camped on either side of the great valley, shouting insults at each other. And occasionally this great Goliath of Gath came along and paraded himself as the champion. Well, since the armies couldn't fight, why don't you send somebody else to fight our champion? Send somebody out to fight him. And of course, since the Israelites didn't have anybody of the stature or the capacity or the ability of Goliath of Gath, it was a sort of stalemate. With every day, without fail, the giant came out and the challenge was issued to Israel, and the poor Israelites squirmed simply because it was a challenge they couldn't accept. And David came along and saw this pantomime going on. What's going on here? Well, they told him nobody got to fight against him. Well, nobody can fight against him. Well, I'll go. He said, I killed a lion and a bear single-handed, and the Lord will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. Well, that man seemed crazy. So crazy, in fact, that they took this lad before the king. Said, here, someone's going to fight the Philistine for you. And Saul was so delighted, he wanted to give David his armor. And David said, no, I haven't proved it, I'm not used to it. And so he went down. Well, you know the story, don't you? But here's the thing, look at verse 55. When Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And then verse 58, and Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? But he's already met him in the previous chapter. It's already the young man who comes up to play the harp for him whenever he has these fits of depression. So it just gives you an idea of the unstable condition of Saul's mind when he doesn't even recognize David here. Look at chapter 18 and verse 2. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. So it was then that David entered into the full-time service of Saul at the palace. But Saul had already met him. But such is the unstable condition of his mind that he doesn't recognize David. Now, notice at verse 9, David's reputation because of the battle with the Philistine and the victories that he gains. Well, Saul eyed David from that day on. One of the symptoms of the kind of madness that Saul had was that he became suspicious of everybody and everything. He became suspicious of David here. And notice verse 10. And on the morrow an evil spirit from God rushed upon him. Now you may have a version that says, and he prophesied among the people. As a matter of fact, the Revised Standard Version says, and he raved within his house. In other words, he had some kind of fit. And he did it while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. And Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul cast the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. Now here again Saul's condition is deteriorating, he's breaking up. And verse 12, Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. And then look at verse 15. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in awe of him, of David that is. In fact, he begins to get very devious in this madness. He becomes obsessed with hatred for David and suspicion of David. And David, of course, is as innocent as the day. He's not done a single thing with an ulterior motive. He has no plans to take over the kingdom from Saul. He's not concerned with ousting Saul from the throne. He doesn't hate Saul. He's serving Saul. But Saul's got designs on David. And notice verse 20. And Saul's daughter Michal loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Now why? Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. In other words, he thought that giving David his daughter was going to be the downfall of... maybe he knew something about his daughter that the Bible doesn't tell us. Maybe he knew the kind of woman his daughter was. If she was anything like her father, well, of course, poor David. However, the thing is that he gives this girl, he wants to give this girl into the hand of David in order to be a snare to him. But it doesn't work out like that. And actually changes his mind and gives her to somebody else later on. However, that's not true. He gives her Michal, and it's Merab. Merab he promises, I beg your pardon. Merab he promises, he doesn't give him Merab, but he gives her Michal instead. And Michal is indeed a source of trouble, as turns out later on. And notice verse 29 of that 18th chapter. Saul was still more afraid of David, so Saul was David's enemy continually. Then he comes right out into the open and he gives orders that Saul is to be killed. 19 verse 1. That David is to be killed. 19 verse 1. Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. Now Jonathan stands up for David. At verse, verse 5. It's very difficult with this Bible that I've got here to see the verse markings. They've got them stuck in the middle of the text in tiny, tiny figures. Verse 5 it is, and about halfway down. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? And Saul hearkened to the voice of Jonathan. Saul swore, as the Lord lives, and that's a very solemn oath, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. Now here's the instability of the man. He's constantly changing his mind, because in verse 7, Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before, And then in verse 9, then an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand. And David was playing the lyre. And Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear. But he eluded Saul, so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped. That's not the end of it. Verse 11. That night Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. And here is where a trick is played on Saul, and a dummy is put into the bed to look like David. And then the next day, the message is sent to Saul that David is sick. And so determined is Saul to kill David that he says at verse 15, "Bring him up to me in the bed that I may kill him." Now you can see how determined he is. And the funny thing is that in spite of all this, in spite of the evidence of his hatred for David and the attempts on David's life, if you turn to chapter 20 and verse 26, you'll find that David hasn't come to the palace. The last line of chapter 20, of verse 25. David's place was empty. Yet Saul did not say anything that day, for he thought something has befallen him. Verse 27. But on the second day, David's place was empty. And Saul said to Jonathan his son, "Why has not the son of Jesse come to the meal, either yesterday or today?" Well, how naive can a man be? I mean, he's tried several times to kill David. At least 3 times he's thrown spears at him there in the palace. And then he wants to know why he's not come to have dinner with him. Now, this could only come from a man who's mentally unstable. That's not the end of it. Look at verse 30. Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan. And finally he says, about halfway down verse 31, "Therefore send and fetch him," that's David, "to me, for he shall surely die." And because Jonathan doesn't go with his father's plans, Jonathan says, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Saul cast his spear at him, at his own son, to smite him. So Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. Now, here's the madness that causes Saul to try to spear his own son. Let's carry on to verses 7 and 8 of chapter 22, and you'll see that it's getting worse. When people have this mental instability, one of the symptoms, as I've already said, is suspicion. They think that everybody's against them. You know, even perfectly innocent actions are interpreted in a wrong way. And something is read into a perfectly innocent remark. Suspicion all the time. Well, you get it here. Notice verse 7 of chapter 22. "And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, 'Hear now, you Benjamites. Will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me?'" In other words, he begins to suspect his own servants. "No one discloses to me when my son makes a league with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me, or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day." You can see how this petulance, this self-pity that he's pouring on himself at the same time. There's only one man responds to that, because everybody knows what's happening to the king's mind. And notice who it is. It's Doeg the Edomite. Now, of course, an Edomite has no love for the Jews anyway. He's no love either for Saul or for any prospective king of Israel. And so Doeg the Edomite stands up and he says, "I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath of Philistines." But he says, "I'll tell you something. I saw David, he went to the priest. And the priest actually sought the will of God on David's behalf, and fed him and gave him a sword, gave him a weapon." Now then, notice what happens next. The king sends for Ahimelech the priest, and the priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, son of Ahitub. And he answered, Here am I, my lord. And Saul said to him, Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait as at this day? And the priest protests the innocence of both himself and his people. And he says, Is today the first time that I've inquired of God for him? No. Let not the king impute anything to his servant, or to all the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all this, much or little. And what happens? Well, the king turns to the guards in verse 17. Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. Now, his servants won't obey him. His servants will not put out their hands to touch the priest. Well, who does it, you suppose? Who stands ready to do it? Well, of course, our friend Doeg the Edomite is willing to do it. And Doeg comes along, and he falls upon the priest, and he kills on that day 85 of the priestly house. And he puts the city of the priest to the sword, men and women, children and sucklings, oxen, asses and sheep he put to the sword. Now, none of Saul's servants will stand by him in these atrocities, and so he has to employ this Edomite, this man of Edom, this descendant of Esau, to do it, who is perfectly ready to do it because of his hatred of Israel. Now, this, as I say, shows you the way that things went with King Saul. From bad to worse, his mind gradually broke up, until finally, you remember, when Samuel dies, he's left alone. He goes to consult with the witch at Endor. Actually, of course, time and time again he says, I'm sorry, I've sinned. But it didn't make any difference to him. He just went downhill all the time. And he went and consulted with the witch at Endor because he wanted to get to know what was before him, what was going to happen. And he asked that Samuel be brought back, conjured up from the dead, to give him advice. Now, remember that God had already banished witches, necromancers, those who had familiar spirits, or mediums in other words. God had already banished them from Israel and said, Thou shalt not suffer these people to live. And so he went in disguise. When he got to Endor, he went into the woman and spoke to her, and she said, Well, you know what King Saul has said about the witches and the mediums, that they're not to be allowed to live. And he assures her that nothing will happen to her. I always wonder if she didn't see through that advice anyway, through that disguise anyway. I often think that she perhaps recognized that here before her was King Saul, and she wanted some kind of assurance from him before she pretended to do anything. But when he assured her that all would be well with her, and he asked her to conjure up Samuel, she knew exactly what she was dealing with. After all, she wasn't stupid. She, as much as anybody else, knew the state of the king's mind, knew his mental instability. And since she says, Well, I can see a figure. Now, she doesn't name the figure. And by the way, there's been a lot of discussion about Saul and the witch of Endor. Did he actually bring back Samuel from the dead? Was it actually the spirit of Samuel that emerged? That's been the question. But if you read that very carefully, you'll find that the woman doesn't say, I'll bring back Samuel. She says, I can see a figure. And Saul says, Describe him to me. She describes Samuel as everybody knew Samuel. And he said, It's Samuel. Well, of course, and that was it. And then there's a message comes. A message that does come undoubtedly from God. When Samuel purports to say, Tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me. In other words, tomorrow you're going to die, you and your family. And that's exactly what happens. This chapter, by the way, is in chapter 28. Chapter 29 describes the death of the king. The Philistines are gathered at Aphek. The Israelites encamped at Jezreel. The battle is joined. The Israelites are put to flight. Jonathan is killed. Saul is wounded. He begs his armor bearer to kill him. And he won't do it. And Saul takes the sword and falls upon it. And that is the tragic way in which this man ended his life. Perhaps the most beautiful postscript to that is David's lament over Saul and Jonathan in chapter 1 of the second book of Samuel. Look at read this with me, looking at verse 19. The glory of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ascalon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. Ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor upsurging of the deep. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. In life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you daintily in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? Jonathan lies slain upon the high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? Now this, to me, this is a marvelous dirge, because that's what it is, in view of the way that Saul has treated him. When you think of the way that Saul has behaved towards David, and yet David is able to speak in this loving and tender and compassionate way about a man who hated him like that. And that's how it ended. That was the first bell. Any comments or observations on this?
As I travel through life with its trouble and strife, I've a glorious hope to give cheer on the way. Soon my toil will be o'er, and I'll rest on that shore where the night has been turned into day. Up in the beautiful Paradise Valley, by the side of the river of life. Up in the valley, the wonderful valley, will be free from all pain and all strife. There we shall live in the rose-tinted garden, 'neath the shade of the evergreen tree. How I long for the Paradise Valley, where the beauty of heaven I'll see. As I roam the hillside, or I list to the tide, as I pluck the sweet flowers that grow in the dale, a faint picture is there of a land bright and fair, where perennial flowers ne'er fail. Up in the beautiful Paradise Valley, by the side of the river of life. Up in the valley, the wonderful valley, will be free from all pain and all strife. There we shall live in the rose-tinted garden, 'neath the shade of the evergreen tree. How I long for the Paradise Valley, where the beauty of heaven I'll see. Though your garden is rare, it is not to compare with the flowers that bloom in the garden above. In the midst of it grows Sharon's perfect sweet rose. 'Tis the wonderful flower we love. Up in the beautiful Paradise Valley, by the side of the river of life. Up in the valley, the wonderful valley, will be free from all pain and all strife. There we shall live in the rose-tinted garden, 'neath the shade of the evergreen tree. How I long for the Paradise Valley, where the beauty of heaven I'll see. Each day I'll do a golden deed, by helping those who are in need. My life on earth is but a span, and so I'll do the best I can.
Life's evening sun
is
sinking low, a few more days, and I must go,
to meet the deeds, that I have done, where there will be no setting sun, to be a child of God each day. My light must shine along the way. I'll sing His praise while ages roll, and strive to help some troubled soul.
Life's evening sun
is
sinking low,
a
few more days, and I must go,
to meet the deeds, that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. The only life that will endure is one that's kind and good and pure. And so for God, I'll take my stand. Each day I'll lend a helping hand.
Life's evening sun
is
sinking low, a few more days, and I must go,
to meet the deeds, that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. I'll help someone in time of need, and journey on with rapid speed. I'll help the sick and poor and weak, and words of kindness to them speak.
Life's evening sun is sinking low, a few more days, and I must go,
to meet the deeds, that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. While going down life's weary road, I'll try to lift some traveler's load. I'll try to turn the night to day, make flowers bloom along the way.
Life's evening sun
is
sinking low,
a
few more days, and I must go,
to meet the deeds, that I have done, where there will be no setting sun.